Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on Ancient Egypt, Gift of the Nile. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to be talking about one of the world's most alluring ancient cultures, not just for me as a professor, and not just for you as students, and not just for the people of today, but going back all the way to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, people have been fascinated with ancient Egypt. So let's see what we're going to talk about. In today's lecture, we're going to start by talking a little about how we actually understand the chronology of ancient Egyptian history. And then what we're going to do is go through the main periods of that history. So we'll start with the rise of ancient Egypt, seeing how it came from these kind of two separate centers of power all the way to a unified state and eventually an empire. Then we'll go into the age of the pyramids, what we call the Old Kingdom. From there, we'll talk about the rise of Osiris in the Middle Kingdom, and then eventually finish off with Egypt as an empire under the New Kingdom here. And what I'm going to be asking you guys to learn along the way is the ability to reconstruct the history of ancient Egypt, identify the meaning of the pyramids and the mummies, kind of the things that are most famously associated with that culture, and then interpret some of the major archaeological and historical sources that we use as scholars to put this sort of history together. Now, when we look at ancient Egypt, right, the things that stick out to us are things like the pyramids at Giza and the temples at Karnak and Luxor, and the mummies and the golden burial masks of King Tut. And so what we're going to kind of do today is look at what all those things mean, right? For us, they're these kind of fascinating objects, but for the ancient Egyptians, all of these things they kind of played a key role in Egyptian culture. And so that's what we're going to dive into. But before we do that, let's get a sense for how Egyptian history is actually put together. So looking at some of the terminology that we use today and how that terminology actually comes out of a historian that's over 2,000 years old. Now, that historian that we're talking about is named Manetho, and he was an Egyptian dude living under Greek rule in ancient Egypt in about the 3rd century BC. Now, the way Manetho put together this history in his work, the Egyptiaca, is by separating Egyptian history into a couple different categories. First off, we've got the dynasty. And a dynasty in ancient Egypt is a series of rulers from the same family. And in ancient Egypt, we've got 31 of these overall. Now, dynasties then are grouped into kingdoms, all right? And so we've got 3 kingdoms, right? The Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And these kingdoms are periods of strong, centralized, stable rule. And then finally, in between the kingdoms, we've got intermediate periods, and we've got 3 of those as well. The first intermediate period, the second intermediate period, and the third intermediate period. And these are essentially the opposite of kingdoms, right? These are periods of decentralized rule, weak government, invasions, instability, that sort of thing. So all this terminology goes back to this kind of Greco-Egyptian historian, and it's still essentially what we use today for understanding the history of ancient Egypt. Now, Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, called Egypt the gift of the Nile. And in this case, that couldn't be more true, right? Herodotus made a lot of kind of crazy claims about the ancient world. In this case, he is spot on. Without the Nile, ancient Egyptian culture does not exist. And so you can see in the kind of overview satellite shot here just what the Nile does in terms of land productivity and farming and agriculture, with the Nile Valley, this kind of green spot going through the middle of the country, and then the Nile Delta, where it spreads off into that kind of triangular shape. And the word delta, right, a river delta, actually comes from ancient Greek, right? You can see the kind of triangular shape here, which is actually the shape of the Greek letter delta, right? And so that's where they get that term. Now, in ancient Egypt, they had 2 different kind of names for these parts of the land. So you can see Kemet up here. This is all the agriculturally productive land, right? So Kemet stands for the black land, and that would include the Nile Delta here, the Nile Valley, the Fayum region. And then they contrast that with Deseret. and that's what's called the Red Land, what we would call the desert. And this is one of the few terms from ancient Egyptian language that we actually still have today, right? So that's where we get our word desert. Now, perhaps a little counterintuitively, we split this into two categories, Upper and Lower Egypt. And we're going to call Lower Egypt, all right, up here near the Nile Delta. And it's a little bit weird, right? Because Lower Egypt is in the north, okay? Upper Egypt is in the south. And take a second, think about like why that might be. And that's because, right, it's all in relation to the Nile River, okay? So the Nile River runs from south to north, and so Upper Egypt is kind of earlier on in that progression. Lower Egypt is where the river pours out into the Mediterranean Sea. The other thing you'll be able to notice here is that Egypt is incredibly protected on all sides, right? So you've got the sea to the north, you've got deserts to the east and the west, and then you've got a series of cataracts or kind of waterfalls along the Nile that make it difficult to navigate via boat from way down here in the south. So it's really, really well protected. Now, in the earliest days, right, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt were totally kind of separate entities. And we can see that in the iconography they use for kingship. Okay, so in Upper Egypt, down here in the south, they would use the hedjet, all right? That's the name for this kind of bowling pin-shaped crown, this white crown that the rulers of Upper Egypt would use. And then in Lower Egypt, they would use the deshret, okay, or the red crown. That's the one with the little curly Q on the front, and that would signify the ruler of Lower Egypt. And so what we can end up seeing is that early on, we see only kings with one type of crown, and then through the unification of these two different areas, we see the combination of both of those. Now, one of the questions I want you to be thinking about is why that unification occurs, right? What is it that makes Egypt, after kind of thousands of years of being, just kind of like any other area of North Africa or the Near East or Europe, right? After thousands of years of just kind of being normal, what sets off that spark that takes it to be able to build the pyramids and build the temples that we associate with it? So think about that. And one of the main kind of answers to that is this idea of irrigation. So when you look at the kind of map of Egypt, right, the topography, the Nile rules everything. And the ability to irrigate that Nile allows you to produce much more food, right? Irrigate much more land, make much more of the land productive. And in order to do that, you have to have somebody to organize that irrigation. And so some of the earliest evidence we have for kingship in Egypt shows the king of Egypt kind of as the ruler of the irrigation process. And the earliest evidence we have here is actually from a guy we call the Scorpion King, right? And so what you can see here, you can see the king. He's much taller than anybody else. And you can see the kind of designation of his name by this little rosette along with a little scorpion. So we call him the kind of real Scorpion King. And this is on what we call a ceremonial mace head, right? A mace you use for smiting your enemies. But in this case, it's kind of a symbol of power for the king of Egypt. So going all the way back before 3000 BC, we are seeing the Scorpion King as kind of the leader of this irrigation project. And you'll notice he's wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt right there. But that's just the white crown of Upper Egypt, right? We don't see exact evidence for unification yet. What you're looking at here is something known as the Narmer Palette. And this is perhaps the best artifact that we've got in terms of giving us evidence, the earliest evidence for the unification of Egypt. And so what you see is a palette, and that is used for kind of grinding makeup out of minerals, right? So different makeup you'd wear on the face, you'd put the minerals in this little area right here, and then you'd use a little pestle to grind them up to make the makeup. But in this case, just like with the mace head, what we've got is a ceremonial one that's used for displaying iconography rather than probably being used in real life. Now, on one side of the palette, what we've got is we've got the king of Egypt, and once again, we can see him because of his great size, holding a ceremonial mace, or holding a mace, right, of power, and then also with the crown of Upper Egypt. We also see the hawk, Horus, associated with kingship there, and the king smiting one of his enemies. And we associate that enemy with Lower Egypt because of the reeds coming out of the back of this guy here, all right? Now, on the back, what we see, right, is we actually see the king of Lower Egypt. So if you look in the upper register here, you can see the king, again, slightly smaller than the other guys, but this time with the crown, the curly-Q crown of Lower Egypt. And so because we've got, right, the king with the Upper Egypt crown over here and the Lower Egypt crown over here, and then we get these kind of intertwined mythical beasts in the middle, what we think is going on with the Narmer Palette is the representation of the unification of Upper Egypt down in the south, Lower Egypt up in the north. Now, kind of Narmer unifying Egypt sparks what we call the early dynastic period, right? So now we've actually got the dynasties that Manetho was talking about. Now, early on, these dynasties were crazy. So dynasties 1 and 2, going back to just after 3000 BC, right? They used to do all kinds of crazy things, right? This is before the age of the pyramids, but when kingship is getting very, very powerful. And in fact, early on, it gets so powerful that when the king dies, he actually kills all of his helpers as well. And so what you're looking at here is something known as the Tomb of Den, D-E-N, and it dates to around 2900 BC. Now, you'll notice it's not a pyramid, right? So the tomb actually kind of goes underground there. But what you see surrounding it are all these other subsidiary graves. And those were the graves for the kind of workers that helped out the king. And so when the king died, he would actually sacrifice everybody that worked for him to be able to help him in the afterlife as well. Now, as you might imagine, right, this is not the most efficient way to run a kingship, right, to run a kingdom. And if you end up killing everybody who works for you, not many people are going to want to work for you. And so the ancient Egyptians come up with a good solution to this. Kind of after the early dynastic period, what we see is we see the same kind of concept, but played out in a different way. So rather than sacrificing the actual people associated with the king, what they do instead is they let those people live and they bury the king with all these little statuettes representing his helpers. And these are known as ushabtis or shabtis. But when you see these little kind of faience and glass and ceramic statuettes of people, very frequently these are put into tombs to help out the deceased in the afterlife. And that way you don't have to kill everybody who works for you. Now, after the first couple dynasties, dynasty 1 and 2, we enter the Old Kingdom, which goes dynasties 3 through 6. Now, the Old Kingdom is kind of important for us because this is literally the age of the pyramids. It's the age of the Sphinx. The kind of most iconic monuments of ancient Egypt date to the Old Kingdom. I want you to think about that for a second. Like when we look at the pyramids, right? This is happening nearly 5,000 years ago, right? 4,500 years ago, they were able to command enough labor to build the Sphinx, build the pyramids, that sort of thing. And that's several thousand years earlier than what we're going to see when we look at the Bronze Age in the Aegean. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at what the pyramids actually are, all right? They didn't just arise out of nowhere. So we saw the Tomb of Den, and that was sort of underground. And what we see early on, in the kind of early dynastic period, is a lot of the tombs look like this, right? And what that is, that's known as a mastaba, M-A-S-T-A-B-A. And a mastaba tomb is essentially a kind of recreation of the primordial mound in ancient Egyptian religion. And the primordial mound is that mound from which all other things arise. All right? And so the idea here is that the king or the deceased will be reborn out of this primordial mound. Now, in the Old Kingdom, what we end up seeing is that Djoser, one of the kings, around 2650 BC, has this great idea to stack one mastaba tomb on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, and we get our very first pyramid, known as the Step Pyramid. Now, a dynasty later, with the king Snefru, what we end up seeing is the same idea of one mastaba on top of another, but now flattening out the sides. But you'll see early on, right, the architects didn't quite get it right. And so they start building the pyramid at one kind of angle, and they realize about halfway through that this isn't going to work, right? The pyramid will collapse if they continue at that angle. And so they actually have to shift it. And this is what we call the bent pyramid right here. And finally, it's a little bit later on, right? About 50 years later, they perfect the pyramids with the Great Pyramids at the Great Pyramid at Giza and the other surrounding pyramids at that site. So let's go ahead and take a look at Giza here. To give you a sense, right? Giza is up here in Lower Egypt. And what we're looking at is essentially the burial place of the kings who ruled in the town of Memphis. And so we see the pyramids themselves. These are serving, again, as tombs for the royal family. And then we also see, kind of cropping up here, a whole complex, right? So we'd get subsidiary pyramids for queens and things like that. We'd get religious complexes for the kind of rituals associated with the dead. And we'd even get kind of workers' villages, right, where people would live to build the pyramids so that they didn't have to travel really far to get there to do their work. So when we're looking at Giza, right, we're looking at an entire funerary complex, not just an isolated pyramid. And let's talk for a second then about the Great Pyramid, right? So when we talk about the Great Pyramid, we're talking about one single pyramid. And it's a 4th dynasty pyramid to the king Khufu, all right? So it's actually the earliest pyramid we have at the site of Giza. Now, when we look at this thing, it covers around 13 acres and is nearly 500 feet high, okay? And it's the burial place for the king himself there. And what we see when we kind of look at the cutaway is that we can see the king's burial chamber right in the middle of the pyramid, but he's also got another burial chamber slightly below that for the queen. And think about trying to actually have to construct that, have these open spaces underneath that much stone without having it collapse. They've also got these air shafts here. We think that those were kind of put in to to enable A, the workers to actually be able to be inside of there when they construct it, and B, that's to allow the soul of the king, the Ka, to escape after death back out into the world. And here are just a few photos of the inside of that pyramid. So this is known as the Grand Gallery, the thing that takes you into the chamber, the burial chamber of the king. And you can see just how finely this thing is constructed. It's actually quite high, so you can walk in standing straight up. And then here we have the actual burial chambers of the king over here, right? And you can see the sarcophagus still in place. And the queen over on this side, right? So fairly plain on the inside, but these kind of open spaces for the burials themselves.